Welcome back. In this segment, we're going to talk about application. In a previous segment, I talked about the importance of application because so frequently, whenever we're doing expository preaching, so many preachers just give thoughts. They highlight elements from the passage of Scripture, but they don't make enough effort to actually apply that to the audience. On the flip side of that, we sometimes have preachers in our contemporary Christian world that simply just run right to application. There is not enough journey through the passage. And I believe that both of those are flawed in a variety of ways. But I want to make sure that you don't mishear this. Application is extremely important. I want to make sure that you know that if you do not apply the passage for your people, quite frequently they'll walk away having learned great passages of Scripture, learned great elements from those passages, maybe even been able to ascertain good doctrinal truths. But if they don't know how to apply it to their lives, if they don't know what to do differently when they walk out of church, it may be all for naught. So I want to make sure that we understand the importance of application and how to do that well. The first element to application that we're going to cover in this particular segment is the idea of making sure that we speak to the heart. So frequently, there are preachers out there that just speak to the brain. They speak to the mind, which can be helpful throughout a course of a sermon. But if you don't speak to the heart, you're not going to be effective in impact preaching. Remember way back at the beginning of this course, I talked extensively about the importance of being an impact preacher. Talked about Martin Lloyd-Jones and his commitment to being an impact preacher, to not just getting people to understand something better, but to move people. You want people to inwardly be inspired to be in awe of who Jesus is. And you want them to be inspired to go live for Him at the end of this message. People should walk away from your sermon having been enthralled by the beauty they see in Jesus. And you do that by speaking to the heart. One of the ways you speak to the heart is making sure that you address people's feelings. People are feelers. Humans have emotions. And I think sometimes we live in certain Christian circles that seemingly make emotions out to be bad. Somehow, if you feel God, then you're being overly emotional about God. Or we don't want to preach in a way that's emotional because we don't want to manipulate people. That's something I've heard from preachers that are out there. And again, I understand the sentiment. I never want to manipulate people. That's never my goal. However, humans are emotional creatures. All humans have feelings. All humans have emotions. And if you try to get humans to ignore their feelings or ignore their emotions, quite frankly, you're just not going to be successful in getting them to listen to you. If you preach a sermon that makes people feel like they have to turn off their emotions while they're listening to you, or they have to turn off their feelings in order to do what you've asked them to do throughout the course of the message, the reality is they're just not going to do what you asked them to do. You may disagree with that, but I have to be frank, that's the reality. If you don't address people's feelings, and if you don't engage them on some emotional level, you're not going to be the impact preacher that God is calling you to be. There was a recent movie, came out in the last few years. I'm sure you are probably familiar with it, called Frozen. And in this movie, one of the main characters was named Elsa. And her parents frequently told her to conceal, don't feel. For those of you who've seen the movie know that didn't quite turn out so well for Elsa. It didn't go so well for the people around her either. You see, when we take humans and we tell them to conceal their feelings, in essence, what will happen is their feelings will find a way to manifest, but it will manifest in a way that is uncontrollable or detrimental. I've seen this over and over and over again in my pastoral ministry. Let me go back to my example from Acts chapter 1 that I used in the previous segment. Whenever you are dialoguing about things like loving those who culture may say is your enemy, or loving those that have hurt you, or choosing to demonstrate the power and love of God, and to be an ambassador for the kingdom of God to those that you would be at odds with, there are going to be some feelings that come up. If I'm preaching from Acts chapter 1 and I'm telling my people, go love those who are your enemies, go love those who have hurt you, they're going to have some feelings. If I ignore that, they're not going to listen to me. If I tell someone in the audience, go love your enemies, but but they have animosity and feelings against that particular person, they're not going to listen to what I have to say. So I have to address those feelings. I may say to them, listen, I understand you may feel this way. And then I articulate what they're feeling. As the preacher, I need to anticipate what my audience is potentially feeling, and I need to then respond accordingly. I may say to them, listen, I know that you've got someone in your life that hurt you, and Jesus is telling you to go love your enemies. Go love the person that potentially hurt you or caused some element of oppression in your life. But you should go love them anyway. Listen, you may feel like you don't want to. And you know what? You might even be justified in that. I want to validate their feelings. I want to go out of my way to make sure they know that they're not necessarily wrong for feeling what they're feeling. However, that God is calling them to rise above their feelings, and that their feelings are valid, and that God wants to heal them of that. Right? If I'm preaching from Acts chapter 1, I'm not going to say, love your enemies, and who cares how you feel about them? I'm going to say, love your enemies. You may feel like you don't love them, and maybe they hurt you, and that's the reason why you feel that way. I would encourage you, come talk to our pastors. We'd love to sit with you. You were hurt. You were wrong. We'd love to help you wade through that. I want to address whatever feelings, whatever emotions are a part of the conversation. When I am challenging my people, when I'm giving them an application, I want to anticipate what will they be feeling? What emotions will rise up? What feelings will this challenge elicit? And then I want to turn around and address that in a very sensitive, pastoral manner. I want people to feel the emotion while I'm preaching. I want them to know that preacher cares about me, and he has given me an antidote to the problem that I'm currently feeling, the issues that I'm currently wrestling through. People will trust their feelings way more than the facts. Now, people shouldn't do that, but they will. If you want, you can get up on a Sunday morning at your church and just say, stop feeling what you're feeling and stop trusting your feelings and just do what's right. You could say that. No one's going to listen to you, or very few people will listen to you. You're not going to be an impact preacher. I remember several years ago, I heard a story of a preacher who had a conversation with a man who said he hated wearing seatbelts, that he never wore a seatbelt, and that frequently his friends would give him statistics about seatbelts and how the statistics prove that if you're wearing a seatbelt, you're far more likely to survive a car accident, that the reality is seatbelts do save lives, and the stats are overwhelming. To deny that is simply obtuse. It's clear seatbelts are clearly a good thing. They clearly are safer than not. This man refused to believe it. However, one day, this man got in a car and put on a seatbelt. And his friend said, what are you doing? For years, you've been against seatbelts. He said, well, last week, a buddy of mine got in a car accident. And he flew through the windshield. He survived, but if he'd been wearing a seatbelt, he wouldn't have gone through the windshield. He says, wait a minute, we've been giving you facts and stats for years that prove that. He goes, yeah, but I didn't feel it. You see, stats and facts don't help people. They may be true, but they don't help people feel. And you have to get people to feel that which is true. You may make lots of true statements, but they don't help people change their feelings. You as a preacher need to find creative mechanisms to get people to feel the truth. Now, again, we don't want to be manipulative, but we want to make sure that we present truths in a manner that will be preached to the heart. We want people to feel the truths, not just understand the truths. A couple practical things you can do to help you speak truth to the heart is really utilizing passion and your own affections. When you are preaching, you should let your emotions come through. Now, I recognize different people have different personalities. Some people are far more animated than others. I myself tend to be a more demonstrative personality. I've been that way since I was a kid. And I recognize not everyone is that way. However, whatever your normal level of passion is, when you're preaching, you're going to have to maybe take it up a little bit. Again, I'm not asking you not to be yourself. I'm simply asking to be the most passionate version of yourself. You have to make sure your affections come through. Now, for some people, that means you actually tone it down in terms of your volume, your intensity, or your voice tones. For some of you, that means you got to ratchet it up a bit. One of the things that I would encourage you to do if you're going to be an effective preacher is go to friends of yours, people who know you well, and ask them, when do I get most passionate? What are the types of things that I'm talking about when I am getting really, really passionate? Recently, I had a friend ask me this question. I said, man, whenever we're talking about basketball, you get really passionate. Whenever we're talking about marriage, you get really passionate because I know you love your wife and you're committed to being a great husband. I said, man, you get really passionate whenever we're talking about Chipotle because you love those burritos. He said, yeah, I do. See, the emotions in his heart start overflowing when certain topics come out. What I would encourage you to do in your preaching is to allow different things to come out in your preaching that you naturally get more passionate about. Whatever the things that you love the most, the things that really kind of get your engine going, whatever get your heart flowing, you want to bring those types of things into your preaching when you're using stories or illustrations. For my particular friend, in this case, he does preach on a regular basis, and he loves his wife. And so I encourage him, listen, whenever you are preaching, you should use your wife and your marriage and your family in your sermons on a regular basis because your heart begins to flow out of that in a really profound way. Of course, you want to be sensitive. You want to make sure you get permission from someone before you use them in a sermon illustration. And you never want to use someone in a sermon illustration in a manner that makes them look really bad unless they themselves have really proactively given you permission to do that. But you want to find people in your life or things in your life that you're really passionate about and allow those things to come up in your preaching. I use Philadelphia sports quite frequently in my teaching because I'm passionate about Philadelphia sports. I'm a fan of the Eagles and the Sixers and the Phillies, and I frequently use those in my teachings. I'm also passionate about food. I'm a big fan of Chick-fil-A and Chipotle, so quite frequently I use those in my conversations when I'm dialoguing with people about theology or doctrine or whenever I'm preaching or teaching. I use things that I'm naturally passionate about, and I find ways to bring those into my sermons. Therefore, it unlocks some natural passions in me, and it allows the audience to see some of my emotions. It really brings down the guard, and it kind of creates a heart connection between me and the people that are listening to me. Another great way to speak to the heart is to preach imaginatively. What I mean by that is we want to use a lot of images and metaphors. One of my mentors was a best-selling author, Shannon Etheridge. She frequently says, "Don't tell me, show me." Sometimes stories can be really helpful with this, but really what we want to do is not just use stories, we want to use really powerful metaphors. We want to use word pictures and images in our sermons. One of the greatest examples that I've ever heard in any sermon in all of church history comes from the great preacher in the 1700s, Jonathan Edwards. In one of his famous sermons, he used this word picture that I think is absolutely brilliant. He was talking about people that try to save themselves or try to make themselves righteous before the Lord. And Jonathan Edwards says this statement. He says, "Your righteous works cannot hold you up any more than a spider web can hold a falling rock." Wow, what a word picture. Right? He makes one statement. It's not this elaborate story. It's not this super complex metaphor. It's not this corny pastor joke. It's a clear, pointed statement using imagery that will grab someone's heart. You see, I can get up on a Sunday morning and say, hey, you can't save yourselves. You're too sinful. You're not righteous enough. You can never earn your way to God. And all those things are true. But those statements in and of themselves don't grab the heart. They don't punch the heart like a statement like the one Jonathan Edwards made. When he says, your righteousness cannot hold you up any more than a spider web could hold a falling rock. You've got a picture in your head right now, and it explains the doctrine in a very clear way. In fact, the Bible uses these sorts of images and word pictures over and over and over again. One of my favorite ones comes from Genesis chapter 4 and says that sin is crouching at your door. What an incredible image. That sin is crouching, it is hiding out, waiting for you to come out of your house to jump on you, like a lion in the brush waiting to pounce on a gazelle. This is the idea that sin is waiting. It is proactive. Therefore, you cannot be laissez-faire against your sin. You can't be passive. This is the style of image that the Bible uses. The Bible uses these word pictures, and therefore we as preachers should do the same. Find images that connect to people's senses. You want to use lingo that will unlock how people feel. Whenever I'm preaching about sin, I'll talk about sin being like spoiled milk. Sometimes you engage in an activity and it ends up being worse than you realize, similar to drinking milk from a carton and you didn't know the milk had curdled. Think about how that feels. You ever drank a carton of milk? Middle of the night, you sneak down and you drink and you thought the milk was good. As a single guy, I frequently have left milk in my fridge longer than I should. And this has happened to me. I've sipped from the carton of milk and instantly I've tasted what spoiled milk is like. And it causes me to want to vomit. Right? Anyone who's tasted something that's rancid or bad feels in the moment what you're saying. And I have now taught them what sin is like. You think it's going to taste good. You think it's going to be pleasing, and it's actually poisonous to you. It's disgusting. It's harmful. You see, I don't want to just teach about sin in a manner that is factual. Sin is bad. Sin is corrupting. Sin will condemn you to hell. Yes, those are true. But those true statements don't grab people's heart. We want to connect to their senses when we're preaching to them. Use imagery and word pictures when you're preaching. The last thing I want to mention about preaching to the heart that I think is really, really important in your application, and that is the idea of preaching wondrously or curiously. You want to preach in a way that calls people to be in awe of who God is. You also want to be curious. You want to pose questions and don't give the answers. I recently had a chance to interview an author by the name of Barnabas Piper for a podcast I host. And in my conversation with Barnabas Piper, he was talking about a recent book he had written called The Curious Christian. It's a great book. I'd encourage every Christian to pick it up. And in the book, Barnabas talks about the idea about the fact that we as Christians in 21st century America have lost our curiosity. That anytime we are engaging with activities in life, we should be asking ourselves, what must God be like that he did this particular thing? We should be curious about things. Ask yourself, what must God be like that he created dogs? I mean, think about dogs for a second. This weird creature that's super high energy in most cases, and no matter what you do to them, in most cases they are really, really loyal. That they sit in your living room and wait for you to come home, and once you walk in, they're excited for you. What is God like that he created a dog? And I don't answer the question. My goal is to get the people in the audience to start wondering about those sorts of things. Now, of course, I wouldn't randomly mention a dog in a sermon unless it was tied to a particular point. But I want to be preaching, I want to be mentioning things, and I want to then ask, what must God be like? Or what is it about God that we think is wonderful or wondrous? Let's say I'm preaching through the book of Genesis, and I get to a point where we're talking about creation. Or I'm preaching through the book of Job or the Psalms. I'm preaching through any passage where creation is mentioned. I want to pause and say, hey, think about this. The universe is huge. It's massive. It's unbelievably beyond what we can understand or fathom. It's so big. What must God be like that he created this massive, incredible universe? Man, doesn't it just show you how big God is? You know, the Bible says that the universe is in the palm of God's hand. Think about how big the universe is. Think about how much bigger God is. Wow. We are in awe of him. In your sermons, there should be moments throughout your sermon where you pause and that you just wonder about God. You are curious about who he is and why he did certain things. That you pose questions without giving answers. That you cause your people to be curious about the character and nature of God so that they can be in awe of his majesty and beauty. If you're not doing that in your sermons, there are people in your audience that are not really listening to you. You're not really being effective in engaging with them, and ultimately you're not being an impact preacher. Impact preachers must preach in a wondrous and curious fashion. You see, propositions and stats and facts, they don't grab people's heart any more than algebra does. Right? Algebra is filled with facts and stats and information. They don't grab people's heart. Algebra isn't fascinating to people. But movies are fascinating. Stories, poetry, that's fascinating. We want to preach in such a way that people are fascinated with the God we are preaching about. Just think about all of the history movies that are out there. History by itself can be pretty boring. But if you watch a movie about World War II, like Dunkirk or Saving Private Ryan, Or you watch a movie about ancient Rome or some other ancient civilizations, like Gladiator and some of the other movies about ancient Rome and that part of the world. You instantly are fascinated with history. You see, lectures about history can be informative and helpful, but movies about history are fascinating. They're entertaining. They suck you in. That's what we want our sermons to be like. We don't want to just give a lecture about God and his character and his nature. We want to tell a story. We want to preach to the heart. We want to grab people's attention. We want to grab their feelings. We want to preach imaginatively. We don't want to just use proposition and facts. We want to preach in a way that is wondrous and curious. We want to usher our people and shepherd our people to the moment where they are in awe of who God is. They're not just learning more about who God is. Being an impact preacher demands that we speak to the heart. I'd encourage you to consider some of these tactics and implement them in your preaching. In the next segment, we're going to talk more about application and specifically about a thing we call the fallen condition focus.